The Ronald Evangelistic Association is pleased to present Wes White with Turn the Page, featuring Ron Dart.
Ron Dart gives 4 principles in following God and teaches that all other decisions are ours as God-educated, common-sense people. God made promises to Abraham and Sarai. How do we respond to God's promises? Uncertainty will always be with us. What God wants from us is character development leading to good decision-making. God is not petty, but merciful and loving. And now we turn the page to 1995 and a sermon titled The 4 Principles of God's Will by Ronald L. Dart.
There are 2 kinds of people here today. People who know that they face some very hard decisions in their life, either right now or very shortly when they get home. The other kind of person is the person who faces some very, very hard decisions when they get home or in the next few weeks and doesn't know it yet. The fact is that all of us are going to be facing we face regular basis difficult decisions, because that seems to be what life is all about. It's one hard decision after another. And a lot of times the solutions we find to the problem we're working on now are the cause of the next problem. And so life is just a series of decisions and problems and solutions, and we go through all of that. What would it be worth to you to be sure that you knew God's will as you approach some of those decisions you have to make? Because among those of us who face the decisions, there are 2 kinds of people. There are those people who never give a second thought to what God's will is and couldn't care less. And then there's the kind of person who won't get out of bed in the morning unless they're absolutely sure that it's God's will that they get up. I remember this young lady who came to counsel with me once when I was dean of students of college. And the fellow had taken her out on a date that week and been dating her for quite some little time. And at dinner, he'd taken her to a dinner at a nice restaurant, and over dessert, he had said, Sue, he says, God has shown me that it is His will that you marry me. Well, she wasn't absolutely sure, and so she thought she would inquire of me. My reply is what you should do. And any of you girls ever face that? The guy asks you over dessert or tells you over dessert that he really believes that it's God's will that you marry him. Wait until he has paid the bill. Take his hand in yours and say sweetly as you possibly can, as soon as God lets me know what His will is, I'll get back to you. And then don't ever go out with him again. How can you know when it is God's will for you to act and when it is God's will for you to wait? Because there are those times when obviously I've got to do something. Obviously there are times also when you have to wait. When should you just trust God, and when should you take matters into your own hands? Even the way you phrase these questions is loaded, isn't it? When should you trust God? Well, always. When should you take matters into your own hands? Well, never. And yet, we all know, don't we, by now, that God could care less whether the pickup truck you're going to buy next week is red or black or puce in color. Don't we? Don't we? We all know that. God does not care what color car, truck, or anything else you buy, and may not even care whether you buy a car or a truck. On the other hand, everyone knows that when the voice of God rolls down the mountain inside and says, "Thou shalt," you better do it. And you better do it now. So we've got the 2 poles of this thing pretty well nailed down. And in between this, there is a vast wasteland of human decision-making in which most of us muddle along in our lives, not quite knowing what God wants and what He doesn't want, and not knowing whether we ought to be making this decision or leaving it to Him. Well, I'm going to give you today 4 principles to consider. I'll give them to you slowly in case some of you want to write them down. Because they're basically, these are not, by the way, being handed down from Mount Sinai. They are being handed down from the pulpit. And these are Dart's principles of decision-making in the light of the will of God, if you want to put something like that on. Number 1, when God gives you a promise, He expects you to wait for it. Now, that's not hard. Hard to understand. It may be hard to do, not hard to understand. For example, if I walk up to you today and I've got an envelope here with 10 crisp $100 bills in it, and I hand it to you and I say, here, take this $1,000. And you take it. Do you have a promise? No. You have a promise. You got $10,000, right? On the other hand, if I tell you or I give you a little note that says, I promise to pay you $1,000, sign my name on it. I put it on, give it to you, and I hand you that, what do you have? You have a promise. There's one thing wrong with that promise. I don't know if you caught it. What's the big question you have? Yeah, you did catch it. When? When do I get this $1,000? Well, see, this is one of the problems with the promises we get from God a lot of times. They come down to us, and they're clear, and we know the promise is there. He doesn't tell us when. And not only does he not tell us when, but his watch does not run at the same speed ours does. And so, soon to him does not mean the same thing that soon to you means. We all got that too, don't we? Fairly clear. All right, that was number one. When he gives you a promise, he expects you to wait for it. Number two, when God has given you a command, he expects you to obey it. That's easy. He says, do this, you do this. He says, don't do that, you should not do that. Number three, when God has given you an example, he expects you to follow it. Number four, when God has given you a lesson, he expects you to remember it. Now, those aren't very difficult. When he has given you a promise, he expects you to wait for it. When he has given you a command, he expects you to obey it. When he has given you an example, he expects you to follow it. When he has taught you a lesson, he expects you to remember it. Everything else in life is up to you. How hard is that? Now, I will say this, though, about this everything else being up to you. God also expects you to use sound judgment when you make those decisions in your life. He expects you to remember your lessons, follow your examples, obey your commands, and wait for his promises. But the decisions are, for the most part, up to you. There's one other very important thing for you to know, and something that oftentimes is overlooked. You are allowed, in the process of making your decisions within God's will, you are allowed to use common sense. For God created man, God created the mind of man, God created the logical system with which we work and operate and communicate, and therefore he expects us to be able to use that logical system in a common sense manner to make some of the decisions that we face in our life. Now, I'm going to try today to illustrate what I'm saying to you, so perhaps you can understand it better, and so maybe you can find a way of making it work for you. If you'll turn back to Genesis 15, we'll go to a classic example and talk about the question of a promise of God and waiting for it to start with. Genesis 15 and verse 1, we come to a man with whom we are all familiar. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying, Fear not, Abram, I am your shield and your exceeding great reward. And Abram said, Lord God, what are you going to give me? First thing God says is, I am your shield, your protector, and I've got a big reward for you. And Abraham says, what are you going to do for me? His life was pretty good, except for the fact that he was a dweller in tents. He lived all of his lifetime out there in the middle of nowhere. He had cattle, he had servants, his life was working. He says, what are you going to give me, seeing I go childless, and the steward of my house is Eliezer of Damascus? I don't have anybody. You give me a great reward. I have no one to leave it to except a servant. Abraham said, you've given me no seed. One born in my house is my heir. My servant is my heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, This shall not be your heir, but he that shall come out of your own bowels shall be your heir. And he brought him forth abroad, and he said, Now look toward heaven. So I guess it was night. And he looked up at the sky, and the sky is just covered with stars. And he said, Tell me if you can number them. And of course, Abraham could say nothing. I mean, what are you going to do? Number the stars that they could see in the desert at night in the Middle East before there were any city lights? Must have been a spectacular show. He said, Count them. He couldn't. He said, So shall your seed be. And he believed in the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness. Now, right here, right there is where most of us find ourselves most of the time. We know what God said, and we know the promises are there, and we believe the promises of God. We believe that he will do the things he said that he will do. And so we say, I believe God, and God looks upon our belief and counts it for righteousness for us too. And we have a relationship with God. Our difficulty, though, is the difficulty we faced a while ago when I said I give you a promissory note, says I will give you $1,000 and I sign it, but there's no when connected to it. And this is the problem that Abraham had. He was already, by the time the first part of these promises were given to him, an old man. He had no child. He was already to the place in life where he did not expect a child. Sarah was too old. He was getting too old. Things just weren't working like they used to work. So he says, it's not going to happen. And I don't understand, Lord, what's going on. He says, no, it's going to come out of your own bowels. Then the problem was, nothing happened even then. And that's where we also find ourselves from time to time. God has promised, we have believed, and nothing's happened. And time passes. And it passes agonizingly slowly. As we wait, and as we wonder, and as we struggle, and as we fret, and as we work our way through the problems of life. And we wonder, what should we do now, Lord? And inevitably the question will arise. I wonder if God expects me to do something about this. I wonder if there's something I can do. Maybe I shouldn't just be sitting here twiddling my thumbs. Maybe I should be taking action. Faith without works is dead. There must be surely something for me to do. Well, that's what Sarah thought in chapter 16, verse 1. Now Sarah, Abram's wife, bare him no children. And she had a handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. And Sarah said to Abram, Behold, now the Lord has restrained me from bearing. I pray you go in to my maid. It may be that I may obtain children by her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarah. They agreed. Now, what you have here is one of the earliest cases of surrogate motherhood. The earliest one, I think, mentioned in the Bible, although there's indications that this was probably a practice. This was practiced fairly far and wide in the ancient world as far as servants bearing children to the master of the house. They had wives, they had concubines, and it was a very different world from ours. But Sarah thought, well, and the promise is that out of his own bowels would a seed come to populate the earth, but it doesn't have to be me. It can be my servant. So she gave him Hagar, her maid, for him to go into her and have a child. We're well ahead, you understand, of in vitro fertilization. We're not talking about artificial insemination here. They did this the old-fashioned way, with all the consequences that entailed as a result of that. Sarah, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, with the Egyptian after Abraham had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her eyes. Aha, I am now better than you are. You know, it's just old human nature. Just as simple to understand, easy to follow, easy to recognize. Every woman here probably knows exactly what those feelings would be like if you found yourself in those circumstances. And Sarah said to Abraham, My wrong be upon you, or is upon you. I have given my maid into your bosom, and when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her eyes. The Lord judge between me and you. Sarah realized when things began to go wrong that what she had done was wrong. It was her solution, not God's. That she had, in a way, crossed over into an area of God's promises, had taken matters into her own hands when she should not have, and she had created a problem as a result of doing so. Now, it's an interesting lesson to think about. The promise was there, and they stepped out, Abraham and Sarah agreed to try to solve this problem, to create and to accomplish God's will, and to do it their way. It was not an illogical decision except for the commandments of God and the sin that would be involved in a man having sex with someone other than his wife. But again, that was a custom of the time. They could find ways in which they would work their way around this type of problem. But it became the solution to that problem, became the cause of tomorrow's problem, big time. This one was really a serious problem, and we are living with it today. He goes on to say, Abraham said to Sarah, Look, your maid's in your hand, you do what pleases you. And when Sarah dealt hardly with her, she fled from her face. And the angel of the Lord found her by a fountain in the wilderness by the fountain in the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, Sarah's maid, where have you come from and where are you going? And she said, well, I'm fleeing from the face of my mistress, Sarah. And the angel of the Lord said to her, you go back to your mistress, and you submit yourself to her. And the angel of the Lord said to her, I will multiply your seed exceedingly, that it shall not be numbered for multitude. Now, this becomes rather interesting, because here is a woman who herself was really innocent. She was a maid, she was a servant, she was a slave. She had no choice in this matter. Her mistress gave her to her husband. And he came into her and she conceived a child. And it wasn't her fault and it wasn't the child's fault. But here we have the law of unintended consequences coming into play. Something has happened that we did not intend to happen. We have a child in the world, and this child, being a son of Abraham, has certain promises due to him for that reason alone. Think about it. God promised that the descendants of Abraham would be thus and thus. This boy is a son of Abraham. Now, God is interested in him. God has to concern himself with him, and he does. The angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are with child, and shall bear a son, and shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your affliction. He will be a wild man. His hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of his brethren. And she called the name of the Lord that spoke to her, you, God, see me, was the Hebrew word for it. For she said, have I also looked after him that sees me? Wherefore the well was called Bir Lahairoi, behold, it is between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bare Abram a son, and Abram called the son's name Ishmael. And Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abraham. You can see why they were beginning to have questions, don't you? He was 85. Sarah was 75. And the promise had not been fulfilled. So they did what they figured out that they could do, and a son was born who would, it says, be a wild man, every man's hand against him and his hand against every man. You know who these people are? The descendants of Ishmael? Well, they sit on most of the world's oil reserves. They are as rich as Croesus. They have become a thorn in the side of Western civilization to this day. The Jews, the Israelis, they are nothing but a pain to them. They are a pain to us. Remember those oil lines that we had back in the 70s? We are living with the results of what Abram and Sarah did to this day and the prophecies that came about as a result of it. The law of unintended consequences. Now, Paul in Galatians, when he begins to speak of this, he talks about he that was born after the flesh and he that was born after the promise. So what Paul is saying is that Ishmael was a child that was born after the flesh. Well, aren't all children born after the flesh? Well, what he means by that is that flesh and blood took matters into their own hands, made their own decisions, tried to solve the problem their own way, and the son that was born as a result of the efforts of human beings. Isaac, on the other hand, was born as a result of the promise of God. So you have the child who was born of the flesh, you have the child who was born of the promise, and they are two very different circumstances. And so we might in our lives face situations where there's a promise of God, we have waited for it, and here we sit wondering, well, should I do something? What should I do if I should do something? How do I go about tackling this problem? And what if I don't do anything and I should have? And what if I do something and it turns out to be like Abram and Sarah, and I have cut across the promise of God and things all go wrong? What then? Well, what then indeed? Take a look at the next chapter, 17, verse 15. And God said to Abram, as for Sarah your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, Sarah shall her name be, and I will bless her, and I will give you a son of her, yea, and I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations, kings of people shall be of her. And before I guess God even got finished, because it sounds like he's in mid-sentence, Abraham fell on the ground and laughed. Now, I can understand that. How old is this man? Look at verse 1. When Abram was 90 years old and 9. 99 years old, folks. And God comes to him and says, now I'll tell you what I'm going to do. Sarah, by the way, is 10 years younger. She's 90 or 89. She's going to be 90, and he's going to be 100 when his child is born. George Burns hopes to play the London Palladium when he's 100. He hopes to walk out on the stage and tell a few jokes, and the rest of the evening will be filled out with other performers if he's able to make it on that particular occasion. And here is a man, 99 years old, whom God says, now, Sarah is going to get pregnant. And Abraham says, what? Now, you've got to understand, the relationship between Abram and God was not exactly like the relationship that you have with God. Abraham sat down and ate with God. They had conversations. They talked back and forth about things. Abraham talked God out of doing things he might otherwise have been ready to do. They could enjoy a glass of wine together. They could enjoy a steak together. They could eat unleavened bread as they did on this occasion. So Abraham is a man. He's a friend of God. And he is such a friend of God that God can tell him something like this, and he can fall down laughing, and God won't strike him dead. Now, he laughed, and Abraham said, he said in his heart, he didn't say this out loud, he said, shall a child be born to him that's 100 years old, and shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear? And Abram said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. Now, I think that's beautiful in a way, I really do. When you stop and understand that this Ishmael, whatever else may have been the case, while he was not Sarah's son, he was Abram's son. And Abram had spent the time with this boy that a father spends with his son. He taught him how to milk. He taught him how to do different things. Taught him how to take care of cattle. He probably taught him how to hunt. They had spent their time together as fathers spend time with sons. He said, son, go get that tool. Bring it over here. And he showed him how to do things. And by this time, Abraham loved this boy. And the idea of Sarah, as old as she was, getting pregnant, and of him having to do what it was that he'd have to do to get her pregnant, and he just said, why can't we just have Ishmael be the one who lives before you? And God said, Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son indeed, and you shall call his name Isaac. And I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant with his seed after him. Now you ask about Ishmael. He said, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him, and I will make him fruitful and multiply him exceedingly. 12 princes shall he beget, and I will make him a great nation. 12 princes. So he was going to have, like Jacob was going to have, 12 sons. And they were going to be a great nation. They wind up, who would have imagined that they'd be sitting on most of the oil reserves and would have the kind of wealth and power that Ishmael has to this day? And they know that's who they are, by the way. They know that they are Ishmaelites, and they know that they are the sons and the descendants of Abram. Something some other people don't know. He says, but my covenant I will establish with Isaac, which Sarah shall bear unto you at this set time in the next year. And he left off talking with him, and God went up from Abraham. What a fascinating story this whole thing is as it works out, as God begins to work his plan out. Now, here's what's interesting to me about this. Well, let's go a little further before I tell you what's interesting to me about it. Genesis 21, in verse 1. And the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did unto Sarah as he had spoken. For Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the set time of which God had spoken to him. And Abram called the name of his son that was born to him Isaac. Abraham circumcised Isaac when he was 8 days old, according to the commandment. And Abram was 100 years old when his son was born to him. And Sarah said, God has made me to laugh. This is funny because on the occasion when God came to Abram on his way to Sodom and Gomorrah to do what was going to be done there, he told Abram again that Sarah was going to have a child. And this time Sarah heard it. She was hiding behind the tent flap. And she laughed. And God says, what's Sarah doing laughing in there? And Sarah says, I didn't laugh. He says, oh, yes, you did laugh. And you are going to have a child. And Sarah said, God has made me to laugh so that all that hear will laugh with me, which you just did. You just did. I had to tell you this in such a way that you would. Because it is right that you laugh. Because it's a wonderful thing, the birth of this child, and what it meant, and how that, in truth, if we could just know it, that this child is the father of so many of us who are here today. In fact, nearly all of us who are here. So this child being born has made it possible for us to be here. And she said, Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah should have give children suck? For I have borne him a child in his old age. Wonderful thing that it was. Now, here's what's interesting to me. Is that Sarah did wrong and recognized that she had done wrong. But she came back to Abraham and says, my wrong be upon you. I shouldn't have done this. And the consequences of this we have already talked about. How that God said he's going to be a wild man. His hand is going to be against everybody. Everybody's hand is going to be against him. And the bad news is he's going to be a powerful person. And powerful tribes are going to come out of him. And they're going to be a trouble to you for all this period of time. So there was bad news. But the good news is it did not sidetrack the promise of God. God did not negate the promise. Didn't do away with the promise. Didn't back out of the promise. Just because they took matters into their own hands mistakenly, thinking they were doing the right thing. And so, so much of the time in our lives, we are paralyzed and can't bring ourselves to make a decision because we think it'll be wrong, and maybe we'll really get crosswise with God. Well, you are going to make wrong decisions, and you're going to face the law of unintended consequences from time to time. But the promises of God will still be there if you can still wait for them, if you can still have the patience, if you can still do what you need to do. Well, the child grew, verse 8, and Abraham made a great feast in the same day that Isaac was weaned. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, which she had borne to Abraham, mocking. And she said, cast out the bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, even with Isaac. And Paul cites this over in Galatians in relation to this occasion. And the thing was very grievous in Abraham's sight because of his son Ishmael. He just hated what he had to do, but he did it. And God said to Abram, don't let it be grievous in your sight because of your bondwoman. In all that Sarah has said to you, listen to her voice, for in Isaac shall your seed be called. This is the line, this is the way it is to go. And so we see then, as I've said to you earlier, the promises of God are there, and when God has given you a promise, He expects you to wait for it. And there is a lesson to be learned by that one all by itself, isn't there? All right, the second thing I said to you was, when He gives you a commandment, He expects you to obey it. The challenge that Abraham was about to face on this particular one is one beyond the comprehension of most of us. In chapter 22 it says this, it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham and said to him, Abraham, He said, here I am. He said, take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, get you to the land of Moriah, and there offer him for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains that I will tell you of. I heard a preacher some years ago who was giving a sermon and preaching fervently about the matter of faith and how when God intervenes and God does this and God promises that, you just do it. You don't argue, you just get up and do it. And he cited the example of Abraham, who God says, you go and you take your son, your only son, Isaac, and you take him and you offer him for a burnt offering where I'm going. And the preacher said, Abraham just went. He got Isaac and he got the things together and they just got up and they went. He didn't agonize over it. He didn't fret. He didn't stew. He just obeyed God. Wrong. The time this really came home to me, and you read the Scripture, if you've been following me up until this point, and you begin to understand the kind of a heart that was in Abraham, you're going to know that that's not right. And I remember when I finally saw the movie, The Bible, I think it was that movie, the movie in which George C. Scott plays Abraham toward the end of the movie, and he's ordered to go and sacrifice his son. It tears the heart out of the man. And in fact, Abraham would not be a fit man to represent God in this little episode as he does, if it had been easy for him to do this, if he had done it in just like that fashion. Abraham had to hurt to the very core of his being when this commandment came down. Now God gave him the very great privilege of representing the Father in the whole story of the Father who gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in Him should not perish but have everlasting life. And so this lesson goes on through. It is odd, isn't it, to think that in working out the promise that a goodly part of your belief system, of your faith, and of your trust in God that He will do what He has said, is to be willing to give up the promise when you have it in your hand. Now, Abram, we're told later, did this not thinking that he was not going to have to kill the boy. He thought he was. It was Paul, I think, who told us that he went ahead believing that God would raise him from the dead. He lost no faith in the promise, but he thought he would have to kill the boy. But he didn't. When God gives you a command, He expects you to obey it. He expects you to follow it right on out to the limit, even if it is the death of a firstborn son. Fortunately, no one else in the history of the world has ever had to face that choice, and you don't have to worry about that one. You have to worry about your choices, about your decisions, and the kind of difficulties that you're going to face from time to time. Then there is the third thing that I mentioned, that when He gives you an example, He expects you to follow it. If you'll turn back with me to 1 Peter, go to the New Testament for a while now. 1 Peter chapter 2, and I'll begin reading in verse 18. Servants, be subject to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the forward or the perverse. This is thankworthy if a man for conscience sake toward God endure grief, suffering wrongfully. For what glory is it if, when you be buffeted for your faults, you take it patiently? Oh, big deal. I'm real patient going through all this trial I'm going through, but I brought the whole thing on myself anyway. There's no credit in that. He said, but if you do well and suffer for it, and you take it patiently, this is acceptable to God. For even hereunto were you called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow in His steps. Now, Christ's entire life was an example for us to follow, wasn't it? We all know that. Now listen, though, to what He is saying here. Christ suffered for us, leaving us an example that we should follow in His steps. Now, by this, He does not mean that we should follow in His steps in a sense of going out and trying to suffer. It's not a seeking out of suffering or a looking for suffering or a pursuing of suffering that we're talking about here. What He is talking about is how you endure the suffering. Listen to Him continue. Christ suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow in His steps, who did no sin, so it wasn't His fault that this thing came upon Him. Neither was any guile found in His mouth. He didn't bring it on Himself. Who, when He was reviled not again. When He suffered, He didn't threaten anyone. He just committed Himself to Him that judges righteously. He didn't answer back. He didn't revile the people who were reviling Him. He simply submitted Himself to it and said, I'm going to put my trust in God who judges all men righteously, and He will judge. Now that's an example to follow. That's an example a person can follow for life, to no matter where it leads. And of course, the prime example for all of us, in all of His life and in all of His work and all of His ministry, is Jesus Christ. You want to know where those examples are? You're sitting there with your Bibles open in your lap. You have a New Testament in that Bible. You have the 4 gospel accounts in which is the greatest example of a life ever lived. You follow it. You look to see what He does and how He then continues to carry on through with it. Now, the fourth thing I mentioned was that when He teaches you a lesson, He expects you to remember it. Turn back to Matthew, the 26th chapter. Matthew chapter 26, verse 31. Then said Jesus unto them, all of you shall be offended because of me this night. Now, here I sit in front of Jesus. I've listened to Him for 3.5 years, followed Him up and down the roads of Galilee and Jerusalem and up and down, and we've faced very dangerous situations up until this place. There are only 11 of us sitting here listening to Him make this statement at this time, and I'm hearing Him say what He says. He looks at me and says, you're all going to be offended because of me this night. What do I feel inside of me? Immediately, I'm going to deny that. There is no way, Lord, that I'm going to be offended by you because of you or anything of the sort. I've been through enough already. I am not giving up now. He said, all of you are going to be offended this night, for it is written, I will smite the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock shall be scattered abroad. But after I am risen again, I will go before you into Galilee. And Peter answered and said, though all men shall be offended because of you, yet will I never be offended. Now, never is one of those words I've begun to learn in my life not to use. It is almost a challenge, and God in heaven looks down upon us and says, well, I'll never do that. He says, oh, really? I wonder how much resolve you really do have. And it seems that when Peter did this, he challenged never. Never challenged never. But he did. He said, I'll never do it. And Jesus said to him, verily I say unto you this night, before the cock crow, you will deny me 3 times. Now Jesus knew his man. He knew that Peter was impulsive. He knew he was bold. Knew he was a brave man. He also knew that deep down inside of him there was a very deep sense of insecurity as well. He was brave and he was afraid, like most of us are from time to time. He was brave enough to follow Jesus all the way to the judgment hall. He and John were brave enough to go on the inside. He was brave enough to go up to their fire and stand there and warm his hands by the fire inside the place. But when a woman, a little maid that was in the place, came up and says, I know you. You're one of the disciples of Jesus. He says, no, I'm not. Don't even know who he is. Later on, somebody says, yeah, you were with those guys. I saw you over in the temple that day. He cursed and swore and denied that he knew Jesus Christ. He absolutely refused to own up to it. He did it 3 times. And the cock crew. And he knew. And he went out and he wept bitterly, as I think most of us would under those circumstances. There are many times in our lives when God has to teach us things. He says, don't despise the chastening of the Lord. For whom the Lord loves, he chastens, and he corrects every child whom he receives. And there are all kinds of things that come our way in our life, and things that we do, mistakes that we make, that are actually chastisement from God. They are lessons for us to learn. They are lessons that we must never forget. And Peter, later on, when he and the others were up in Galilee and Jesus had cooked them a meal alongside of the lake, and they were walking down the shore together after dinner. Jesus walking alongside Peter, and I can visualize him kind of hooking his arm in Peter's arm and pulling him over close and walking shoulder to shoulder and saying, Peter, you love me. And Peter saying, Lord, you know I love you. Feed my sheep. They walked a little further down. He says, jerks his arm again. He says, Peter, you really love me. He said, Lord, you know everything. You know I love you. They walked a little further down. He says, Peter, do you really love me? And he really got upset about this time. He just said, you really know I do love you. He said, feed my sheep. And that was the end of the episode. That was the whole thing. But can you imagine Peter as he realized that he denied Christ 3 times, and Christ made him affirm him 3 times? What that meant to him? Do you think that he ever forgot it in all of his life? I think one of our difficulties in learning our lessons and remembering our lessons is that we sometimes don't realize it's a lesson because we're not paying attention. We don't look to see God in our lives. We aren't aware of God in our lives. We aren't aware that this challenge that we face is one more new thing for us to learn from. We aren't aware that this decision I have to make here is one, and God is not going to give me the answer to it. He's going to make me decide, and then when I get out the other side of it, I'm going to look back and I'm going to learn from the thing that I have been through. And that decision I made last week that got me into so much trouble, I should have known better than that. I really should have, because I had a biblical example I didn't follow. And all down the line, we learn lessons and we forget them. The remembering of this thing is something that I think we have a great deal to do with. As we study, as we pray, as we draw near to God, as we look for God in our lives, not to make our decisions for us, but to teach us as we make them, and as we make mistakes and do stupid things and take matters into our own hands and create all kinds of unintended consequences that we and our children and our children's children will have to live with. If we don't learn from them, they're lost. They're wasted if we don't remember them. So there are your 4 principles. If God gives you a promise, He expects you to wait for it. If He gives you a command, He expects you to keep it. If He gives you examples, He expects you to follow them. If He teaches you a lesson, He expects you to remember it. Well, how can I know all these things? Well, you're sitting there with a Bible full of them. That's one of the places you know them. But now I want to give you the 5th principle. I didn't tell you this was out here. But this is here, and it's important for you to know. The 5th principle is this: certainty will always be denied to you. Being able to say, I know absolutely for a fact that it is God's will that you marry me, or whatever it is, certainty will always be denied to you. Now, why is that so? Well, what fool can't make a decision if God comes down, appears to him by his bedside at night and says, now, John, I want you to take that job tomorrow. Or they're going to offer you this job tomorrow and I want you to turn it down. Well, any fool could do that. And where's the learning? Where's the growing? Where's the development that comes from that? Certainty will always be denied you. Now, don't give me the thing about, well, I'm certain I'm supposed to keep the Sabbath day. That's not the area of that's not the kind of decision I'm talking about. I'm not talking about these two wings out here. I'm talking about that middle ground that I mentioned where most of our decisions lie. You're never going to be certain about things in those areas. You are going to have to decide and act and do or not act and don't do based upon the best you've got. Because it's in the process you're going to get a chance to develop faith and obedience, judgment, patience, persistence, perseverance, all these things that go to make up this strange thing we call character. Now, I hate to be the bearer of bad tidings in a way, or I hate to have to be the one to tell you this, but there's a lot of really wonderful stuff in the Bible about grace and mercy and salvation and how it's not by works of righteousness which we have done, but by His own mercy He saved us, and that is by the grace of God, not of works. All those wonderful things are just as true as they can be. But I'm afraid those wonderful things do not relieve us of the responsibility of developing character. Character. With all that means, with all the pain that's connected with it, with all the frustration that goes along with it. In 1 Peter, the 5th chapter, and verse 5, Peter says, likewise you younger submit yourselves to the elder. Yea, all of you be subject one to another, and be clothed with humility. For God resists the proud, and gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, that He may exalt you in due time, casting all your care upon Him, because He cares for you. Be sober, and be vigilant. You have an adversary out here, the devil, who walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Resist that one, steadfast in the faith, knowing that the same afflictions are accomplished in your brethren that are in the world. But the God of all grace, who has called us unto eternal glory by Jesus Christ, after that you have suffered a while, make you perfect, establish you, strengthen you, and settle you. That's a troubling scripture. I really go through a lot of my life, just like you do, feeling unsettled. I'd like to get to where I could feel settled. And of course, this idea of being strengthened, and having the strength and the settlement and the direction in my life, this is something that all of us would really yearn for and look for. Did you notice, though, that this word after and the word while, a while? After you have suffered for a while. And here we go back to this same old problem again. My watch fell off a minute ago. It might as well have, because it means nothing to God. A while to me is the distance between now and lunch. With God, it could be the distance between where I am right now and my 100th birthday, which is a long way off. And He says, after you have suffered a while. Suffered. Now, what the suffering is involved about, folks, is mostly the stuff that we bring on ourselves by the decisions that we make and don't make through our lives, because we really don't wait for the promises of God. We really don't obey the commandments when we've got them in our hand and know all about them. We don't follow the examples because we really don't study them and think about them, meditate on them, pray about them. And we forget the lessons we've learned. And as a result of all that, and because we keep waiting for certainty, we don't make a decision at all in some cases, we suffer. And as we suffer, we learn. And as we learn, we develop character. And we may somehow, some way, come to the place where we might be useful to God for something. He says, after you have suffered a while, make you perfect, establish you, strengthen you, and settle you. To Him be glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen.
Turn the Page is a production of the Ronald L. Dart Evangelistic Association. To contact us or for more information, please visit our website, RLDEA.com.